Let's decolonize Africa. Over the last few decades, white people from all over Africa have been chased away through a process called decolonization. The calls are very loud these days in South Africa, and the process is underway through the attempt to expropriate land without compensation legislation. The threat of violence is constant against a minority that occupied the land for over 300 years. They are called the Afrikaners and are situated in the last bastion in Africa. Over the centuries, many seafaring nations came to Africa as it was seen as savage lands where almost nothing was happening. The indigenousness people that roamed the plains were still nomadic tribes that fought nature and each other to occupy more land to enable them to hunt and gather more food for their meager tribes. Very little in the form of development happened in this continent south of the Sahara Desert. When the first explorers came to this region, they found that the tribes were in constant conflict with each other and that the land was not being used. All along the coastal areas, the seafaring nations built colony stations that consisted of permanent structures, and to provide for these colonies, agriculture was established. Trade negotiations with the locals happened on a regular basis, and eventually trade was expanded to the slave industry that was flourishing for centuries as new lands were occupied. Because of the strength and stamina of the then indigenous people of Africa, many slaves were captured and traded. In many cases, captured prisoners from one tribe were sold to the slave trade by the chiefs of the victorious tribe. The chiefs were just too glad to get rid of these prisoners because it would mean fewer mouths to feed that did not contribute to their tribe. But what was happening all over the colonies was development and expansion of these newly founded colonies. Slaves and other prisoners were used to build the newly found lands that were far off at sea. But as the colonies in Africa expanded, so did the conflicts with the locals. Because of the superior technologies of the colonists, many of the locals died until peace was made and a cooperation agreement could be reached where the indigenous would provide service to the colonists. In return, they were taught new skills and the use of various forms of technologies that they have never witnessed before. With this mutual beneficial arrangements, the life expectancy of the local tribes were raised. As time went by and the continent was fully occupied, the development education of the local tribes changed. As technologies became available in Europe, it was also exported to the various colonies as the homeland still remained in control of these various colonies. Eventually the colonies seceded from the European masters and became fully fledged countries that were in control of their own destiny. Over time, the countries on the African continent grew into civilized societies that traded with all the countries around the world. The exchange of technology still happened between Europe and Africa. But as the living standard of the original Africans grew, so did their numbers, and because of their numbers they started to demand more and more from those that brought their living standard up. The originals eventually started to drive the ones that brought them into the 20th century away. And as the so-called settlers left what has become their homes and countries, what they built over the years started to collapse. Infrastructures were not being maintained and the clashes between the originals escalated. In some cases, total genocide was committed by one original tribe over another. The living standard in these decolonized regions fell again as the quest for power and dominance grew. Now to the last bastion, where the latest efforts are underway to get rid of those that made Africa their home, South Africa. Since the advent of democracy in 1994, all efforts by the now majority government is to drive the last white people from the continent. Under their leadership, the African National Congress have neglected the infrastructure, and it is currently evident that the total collapse of all services will happen in the near future. Now here we are sitting with the dilemma of epic proportions. The whites that made South Africa their home have nowhere else to go, and the originals want to use any means possible to get rid of their legacy. But the calls for decolonization come from the younger generation that are being encouraged to acts of violence to attain their goals. There was even a call to decolonize science from one of the local student bodies. This call is actually laughable, as everything that they use in their daily lives are based on colonial science. Say all the whites, coloreds, Indians and Chinese leave South Africa today in a mass exodus, and they take their technologies and developments with them to adhere for the decolonization call. What would be left? Let's remove some of the technologies from the lives that some call for. No more communication over cell phones, as this was a colonial science invention. So there will be a total lack of communication with the rest of the world.
But we will still have the internet with Facebook and Twitter to communicate with the rest of the world.
Wrong again. The internet and the computers that you might use is an invention of the colonials and not local developments.
But we can still travel?
Wrong again. Planes, trains and automobiles were developed by the colonials, and with you decolonizing everything, no more transport in the form of cars, trains, planes or even motorized shipping.
So we will have to walk to our employment to make a decent wage so that we can actually buy food to feed our families?
No places of employment left, because it was the colonials that brought the technologies to build the structures to house the businesses that use technologies from the colonials to manufacture goods for the shops and infrastructure. But then again, money would not be available, as this is also an invention of the colonials that you so despise. So even if there are shops and shopping centers around, you would not be able to buy anything.
So what will we do the whole day? Sit at home?
Unless you build yourself a grass hut like your forefathers did, you would have to sleep under the stars with no form of protection. As it was the colonials that brought the technologies with them to build permanent structures that house your family, provide schools and even shopping malls.
Why would we have no protection?
Well, the clothing you wear comes from the colonials, and since you decolonized everything, no more dresses, shirts, skirts, trousers or shoes. You would have to find animals to skin to make clothing again, the same way your forefathers did. You will need to hunt again and learn how to live off the veldt, as this would be your only source of food and water. There would be no more taps or reservoir to retain water for later use. This is all technologies that the colonials brought into the country.
But that would put us back almost 400 years in our development.
Yes, it would, and you will remain in this state until you realize that you are a part of the bigger world around you, and in order to progress in life, you will need to adapt to the current things you have. Stop blaming others for your own failures. They are not in control of your life. You are the only person that can make a difference in your life is you. You do not appreciate the things the colonials brought into the lives of your forefathers and so into yours. You are the result and the outcome of a sequence of events that started millions of years ago, and the sooner you start to realize that the colonials brought your standard of living up to what it is today, the better for you as an individual and as a collective. If the colonials never came with their farming methods and their medicines and other technologies, you would most probably still live in a grass hut and hunt and gather for your tribe to survive. If you want to discriminate against something, make sure you understand the consequences of what life would be like without those that you despise as the enemy and then never entered Africa. We do not say that the way it was done was the right or the wrong way, but what we are saying is that these people are part of the past that cannot be denied. Even though the politicians and other leaders spread their own versions of events of the past happened. These other races would not have been able to build up a thriving country without the labor your forefathers and mothers provided. So the past is what made you to be where you are today. If you manage to get rid of all the other races in South Africa, the whole system would come to a screeching halt, and you would once again plead for the colonials to help feed and clothe your people brought value into your lives. So rather than fight and try to diminish each other, find a way to work together and rebuild a beautiful country to realize the hidden potential and all forms of discrimination within your country and rebuild it together to what it could be.